I think part of what South by Southwest and other events do really well, or in our best days, is provide inspiration. That's reinforced every year when we have a speaker that gives a specifically inspirational message, and we hear from attendees how much they like that. I think that in 2019 and 2020, people need and want inspiration more than ever. And I think that in some ways the current political climate plays into an event, the strengths of an event like South by Southwest, in that we offer a lot of inspiration and we offer a lot of sensory overload. So you can have a day, 2 days, 3 days of escaping the news cycle, escaping what specific scandal is, or challenge, or problem, or debacle is happening, and that is a much needed thing.
The South by Southwest Festival has grown from a small local music festival into one of the most influential gatherings for music, film, interactive technology, and more. In this episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast, Jon and Scoop visit with Hugh Forrest, Chief Programming Officer for South by Southwest.
Welcome to the Plutopia News Network. Today we're going to be speaking with Hugh Forrest, who is the Director of Programming at South by Southwest and has a long history with South by Southwest, going all the way back to South by Southwest Multimedia, which we'll talk about. I'm John Lebkowski, and Scoop is here, Scoop Sweeney. You can find us on Twitter as Plutopia, at Plutopia, and on Facebook as Plutopia News Network.
It's great to be here. John and I go way back. We could bore you with all the details from the early years, when of course it was much better than it is now.
I should have saved my copy of the Austin Challenger.
Yeah, but there's a lot of history. Some of it good, most of it so-so.
So you were on the path to being a journalist, really, right? You had your own publication, the Austin Challenger, and then you were writing for the Chronicle, as I recall.
Correct on both. I always wanted to be a writer when I was in college, and went to college in Ohio, came back here, was doing a bunch of different writing projects. And I often joke I still want to be a writer when I grow up, so maybe someday I will be.
So how did you, the obvious question, how did you make your way into South by Southwest? How did you become involved?
I knew I was doing this thing called the Austin Challenger. It was a monthly publication, alternative publication, not because of its politics, but because of its publishing schedule. I was kind of friendly rivals, not even really rivals, with the Chronicle. Because we were so much smaller, we were no competition for them at all. But I had come to know the folks behind it, and so that was kind of my entree into South by Southwest. And specifically, my entree was that I had bought, or my dad had helped me buy a Mac Plus and a laser writer to help produce the Challenger, because one of our second biggest bill was typesetting, and we could do all that typesetting on desktop printing. And at one point I told the folks at the Chronicle, hey, I got this cool new thing. I don't have to do typesetting anymore. And so Roland called me up, I think, 2 weeks before the second South by Southwest was supposed to begin. And it's like, can we put our database on a computer? And I said, well, that's what computers are good for. Database is really good for that. Then there was a little pause, and how about your computer? So I got hired because I had a computer and they didn't. And that was my initial entree into South by Southwest. And it's always a funny story to tell, and particularly when you think that computer was a Mac Plus, which is like 1/1000th of our even smartphone at this point. But back in the day, it was relatively state of the art, right?
And it was just a music festival then, right?
Correct. It was when South by Southwest started in 1987. It was music only, so it wasn't until 1994 that we added what was a combined film and multimedia event. And again, the four founders of the Chronicle, four founders of South by Southwest. Three of them were from the Chronicle. Roland Swenson, then Lewis Black and Nick Barbaro. Particularly Lewis and Nick were big RTF geeks, radio, television, film department at UT. So they had always wanted to do a film event, and when we added film in 1994, that really kind of began to fulfill their vision of what this thing would be. And multimedia was a little bit of a thrown into the mix somewhat at the last minute there.
Yeah, I recall showing up for the first multimedia conference, and there were just a bunch of computers set up, and everybody had CD-ROMs.
Yeah.
And of course, nobody really was talking about the internet very much back then, because the internet it certainly hadn't mainstreamed. It wasn't that much of a thing, but I know I met Dewey then. You want to talk a little bit about Dewey and his connection?
Well, Dewey was the initial driver behind this thing called South by Southwest Multimedia.
We should say Dewey Winburne.
Dewey Winburne,
yeah.
Correct. Dewey was this force of energy and was very involved in what was then very much state-of-the-art, as you mentioned, John, and CD-ROMs, and had done some pretty significant CD projects in that CD-ROM space. It is interesting in the whole cycle of how South by Southwest has worked, in that when we first started multimedia, it was in many ways focused on education, because Dewey was a teacher and educator and felt very strongly about that. And then after a couple of years, we pushed a little bit away from that. Then, flip forward to 2009, we added in a thing called South by Southwest EDU, which focuses on education and innovation in that space, and very much kind of picks up after a few decades on where Dewey started with this thing in 1994.
Well, I guess it's also important to mention that Dewey's projects tended to be like social good-oriented sort of projects, and that was part of the DNA too, right?
Dewey was a strong believer in the power of technology, the power of new media, the power of these emerging kinds of platforms to level the playing field between the haves and the have-nots, to have this social good element. And Dewey was, again, he spent a lot of time teaching. He particularly taught coding skills to at-risk youth. So that was really neat to have that kind of sentiment behind what we were doing. Dewey passed away in 1999. We still kind of honor that vision with a thing called the South by Southwest Community Service Awards, where we highlight, showcase, honor people who are using technology to help level the playing field.
And that used to be called the Dewey Winburne Award.
Yeah,
right?
It's still kind of colloquially called the Dewey Awards, but it's a real cool way to honor that vision. And I will always say that, what South by Southwest has morphed to after 20, 30 years, and the scale, that was kind of really the vision that Dewey had back in 1994, that there would just be all these things going on. And I used to tell Dewey in 1994, we need to have more focus here. And Dewey was like, no, it needs to just be everything. And that's in a way what happened. So kind of amazing.
Well, one of the great things about South by Southwest is that there's an aspect of experimentation, that you're always trying new stuff, right?
I hope so.
You talk about morphing. The physical footprint of South by Southwest has changed dramatically from the early days to now. How do you characterize that, and how much of a challenge is it now?
The physical footprint, correct, has grown exponentially. And that is, scale, particularly in non-virtual environments, is very, very challenging. And has been challenging to us as we've grown. I think one of the many elements of that challenge is that morphs what we see in a lot of the current world and our challenges now is that when we were significantly smaller and everything occurred in one venue, or even in one or two rooms, virtually all the attendees had kind of the same baseline experience. What do you think of that session 11 o'clock this morning? Oh, I thought it was great. Oh, really? I thought it was horrible. That guy didn't know what he was talking about. Oh, of course she did, or whatever. Now that we have 7 different venues and 45 different sessions going on at any one time, you lose that element of one shared baseline experience, and that creates a lot of different challenges. And again, I think that in some ways parallels, or in a lot of ways parallels what we see with the silos and segmentations that social media has created, and the kinds of ways that's divided our society and civilization, and the kinds of challenges that has led to.
Yeah, it used to be that there was a really strong sense of community, say among bloggers. This was the conference for bloggers to come to and hang out together, and I guess the late 90s, early 2000s, and you reliably knew that you would see the same set of people every year as you came. But eventually, as it grew bigger, it was hard to sustain that kind of community, and some people stopped coming, while of course a whole lot others started coming.
Well, I distinctly remember, John, at some point you organizing a session, must have been some point in the mid-90s, about online community and how big a focus that was.
That was with Gail Williams from The Well.
Yeah, and community certainly remains a big part of the event, but again, it's that what that experience of community is quite different. Personally, while there are many things that I miss about when South by Southwest was a much younger and much smaller event, I'm less wistful for that time when it was the same group of people year after year, because I thought gets a little bit too much like a high school reunion that gets a little bit old. I liked when we start having more
diversity,
more turnover, more churn in the crowd, because it's their first time, they're experiencing it new, and if you've experienced it 2 or 3 years, you have different expectations, and the whole thing comes off differently. So again, that was one of the consequences of growth, that again you saw different people coming in, but again, something that I particularly liked or have liked is that those new crowds coming in, new kinds of people, and initially it was new and different people from around the U.S. and on the interactive side, certainly in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot more new and different participation on an international level.
You speak about diversity. The most recent South by certainly raised the bar on that with your political track that you created with all the Democratic contenders. How difficult, that's a silly question, but how difficult was it, assuming that they would just walk in the park?
The timing worked out really well in March 2019, and we had 6 or 7 candidates involved. and even maybe it was even more because Andrew Yang spoke also, although he wasn't part of the stuff we did at ACL. So it came together nicely, and as with a lot of things that we put together at South by Southwest, it was less my Rolodex and more me knowing someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who could pull that person in, and so that sense of community that Jon talked about really is important in terms of organizing. And I think that the attendees enjoyed seeing some of those candidates, and the candidates got a lot out of it also. I was listening to a CNN broadcast fairly recently, and I didn't realize that Mayor Pete, March 1st, 2019, he was at 1%, and by the end of the month he was at 5%, and a lot of that growth came from the CNN town hall he did at South by Southwest, and then the couple of sessions he did at South by Southwest. So I mean, we've seen this with startups for 10, 15, 20 years, this idea of the South by Southwest bounce, where successful startups can get a big push out of the event. We saw that in 2019 with these candidates, where they could get a nice little push also.
Have you had any criticism for focusing more on Democrats and not Republicans? Not including Republicans?
Yes, of course we have. We did, I mean, for March 2019, it was just the factor of having so many Democrats running and no Republicans running. John Kasich spoke, as did Kevin McCarthy. So you had two voices on the Republican side. We would like to have more representation from both sides of the aisle at South by Southwest. It has certainly turned out that with Democrats coming here, more Democrats coming here in the past, it tends to be that we continue to get more Democrats, but hopefully that can begin to get a little more balanced in the future.
And you actually collaborated with Obama, right, on something at the White House?
President Obama spoke at South by Southwest in 2016, March 2016. That was certainly one of the bigger highlights in 30 plus years of South by Southwest. And then from that engagement, we worked with the White House to help create an event called South by South Lawn, which happened in October 2016, as the name implies. It was on the South Lawn of the White House. It was this incredible experience. It had been raining for 3 days straight in DC, and then it quit raining, blue skies, nice warm day. Certainly a beautiful backdrop of the White House. About 20 total sessions, with a really strong push to social good, social impact, and how tech can improve on that. The last session of the day was President Obama talking to Leonardo DiCaprio about climate change. And, I remember being there and thinking to myself, wow, this is fantastic, and this will be something that we can do for several years down the line. And then history changed us a little. So it didn't quite happen that way.
You haven't invited Donald Trump to speak?
We haven't made that invite yet, and we haven't been invited back for a repeat of South by South Lawn.
How do you think that, in your worst fears, how that would work out if somehow someone said, yes, President Trump wants to come to South by Southwest?
It's, it's a question or thought we've talked about a lot internally. How do we deal with that? I think that at minimum we would say that's great, but we get to dictate the interviewer. And I'm not sure that the White House would want to participate. The current White House would want to participate under those kinds of circumstances. But even internally, we've had strong debate on that. That well, you can't even invite this person because this person is so divisive. So that we have not been faced with that choice yet.
With the divisive politics the way they are, having any kind of public event is always a gamble. Yeah, I spent a lot of years in the Bay Area and in the event business, and the security around any event, especially one that might have some controversy involved, is challenging. Do you take special steps when it comes to people like those politicians? I'm sure, of course, the local police and law enforcement do.
Well, any big event, and certainly, like it or not, South by Southwest qualifies as a big event. At this point, you're working a lot with local police and Homeland Security with the context that you want to make the event as safe as possible. So there's that, and we've been fortunate that we have been pretty safe with certainly a few unfortunate exceptions there. I think that a little bit back to the Trump question you had, Scoop, was that I think part of what South by Southwest and other events do really well, or in our best days, is provide inspiration. That's reinforced every year when we have a speaker that gives a specifically inspirational message, and we hear from attendees how much they like that. I think that in 2019 and 2020, people need and want inspiration more than ever. And I think that in some ways the current political climate plays into an event, the strengths of an event like South by Southwest, in that we offer a lot of inspiration and we offer a lot of sensory overload. So you can have a day, 2 days, 3 days of escaping the news cycle, escaping what specific scandal is, or challenge, or problem, or debacle is happening, and that is a much needed thing. The hope is that when we're selecting speakers or big name speakers, that they fulfill that checkpoint also. Does this person offer inspiration? I think that's one of the reasons that we pushed a little more towards politicians in 2019. Some of these politicians are inspiring, some more than others. By the same token, the tech leaders who we'd showcased for many, many years, in 2019, some of these folks weren't as inspirational as they had been in the past. So, or we learned some of the downsides of tech, so harder to showcase inspirational leaders there.
Yeah, it feels like there's a little bit of fog in the air right now. You know, it's hard to look anywhere and get a strong sense of like inspiration or a sense of commitments to social responsibility.
I like your optimism, John, there with a little bit, because I would say that we are in full-on San Francisco,
very
4
dense
o'clock.
fog. Okay, I got it's sort of Halloween night.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although, at the risk of name dropping, earlier today, Dan Rather was over here looking at the South by Southwest office, and I had a chance to talk to him for 2 minutes. And said, "Are we going to get out of this?" He said, "Yeah, I think we are."
Yeah, he's quite an optimist, actually.
So I was that was a highlight of my day, hearing him with that perspective, and I hope he's right.
You remember what Confucius said? The way out is through the door. Why is it that nobody ever chooses this method?
Yeah.
We just got to find the door.
Yes, well, which has become harder and harder with that light/heavy fog of yours.
So clearly, from what you're saying, it sounds like you see that you feel a social responsibility at South by Southwest, that you understand this is like a huge conference and high visibility, and that you're trying to take care that it conveys the right kind of messages, I guess, and creates some sense of hope and inspiration.
Yes, certainly we've had plenty of missteps along the path to that goal, but I think that people want to go to conferences and festivals for education, for networking, for inspiration, and again, where we are in 2019 and 2020 for Sanctuary. I mean, it's a relief from the storm out there, and to the extent that we can provide that and provide speakers that offer those things, that is part of the success of the event. Certainly, not all of our speakers are scooping up big handfuls of inspiration, but I think that a lot of them are, and again, we're continually amazed and impressed at how much that resonates with the community.
Go ahead.
Is there you've added numerous tracks to South by Southwest. Is there a track you've had in the back of your mind that you would really like to add on, but just haven't been able to work it in? Something special to you?
We have a lot of debates internally about what tracks we'll do from year to year. And a lot of great ideas, and there are a lot of things that I've pushed for that I've been convinced by other people smarter than me that it's not quite the right way to go. One of the things that I've talked about a lot to my staff is we should do an international track, and we really need to highlight the importance of the global perspective, again, particularly in 2018, 2019, 2020. And it's a good idea, but the counter argument to that is, well, then you're essentially saying that all the international stuff goes in that one track, and other international stuff won't go anywhere else. And okay, well, if that's not the way it should be, there should be international stuff throughout. The value or I think one of the values of how we organize South by Southwest with a number of tracks is that given the large number of sessions, the track titles help people to better kind of understand the focus. So yes, having an international track would better highlight the international stuff we do, but might be in some way limiting. And that's with a lot of the ideas that we have on tracks. Well, we should do a track on diversity. Well, does that mean that that's only the only track that has diversity and inclusion, or does every track have that? Yeah, you're right. Every track should have that.
Well, but it would be like an international track would be about international, like the international context, right? So the subject is like maybe globalism, or talk about borders and globalist views versus nationalist views and that sort of thing. I could see a track like that forming, and that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be an international presence in other tracks.
They're good. There are strong arguments to make for all these things. I think, Scoop, to some extent, you're asking, are there things that you wish we'd covered or we haven't covered enough? And I feel like with the amount of programming we do, roughly 1,500 total sessions every year, it's hard to find something that we're not covering. And again, the big kind of umbrella to all this content is creativity. That's the through line that connects the session that's got the 2020 candidate with the session about new touchless interfaces, to the session that's about how AI can create next generation art. It's thinking creatively, and the fact that South by Southwest happens in Austin, a very creative city, in a time of the year where spring is coming out and the world is getting physically reborn. These are all things that kind of contribute to what I think is the magic of this event.
There was a time when the conference programming was a little more top down, and I know there would be people who would program tracks. I even did a couple. At some point you changed to a more sort of bottom-up approach with the panel picker, and now you've got panel picker, and then you have some people judging, and then you have staff. How well is that approach working now? Do you think you're getting the best possible programming out of the more bottom-up and democratic approach, and calling out to the community for proposals and that sort of thing?
I think that again, it's something that we debate about a lot every spring post South by Southwest. Do we move on from this panel picker approach, and do we just curate everything? Maybe. What I like about the panel picker is it again emphasizes this belief in the power of community. It gets lots of people involved. It shows that we want their input, their feedback. It helps us engage with this community in a way that would be hard to otherwise. And it helps bring new and different speakers into the event, such that we're not simply recycling the same group of speakers that speak at a lot of different tech events. So it reflects a belief that, we're all very creative and very smart in our own individual ways. So I like how we do this now. And to be clear, about 75% of the total programming comes via speaking ideas that came in through the panel picker. The other 25% is stuff that we are curating. That tends to be a little bit of the higher level speakers, keynotes, featured speakers, that type thing. But I feel like the system is one of our strengths, and in that sense, something that we'll probably continue doing well into the future.
And originally, South by Southwest was really sort of like three conferences happening at once, or three festivals. There was music, and then there was film, and then eventually there was interactive. And especially post-digital convergence, it feels like the conference, those pieces are starting to blend together. Do you think there'll ever be a time that you really don't have much of a separation, that just all of those things are part of one big whole conference?
Well, yes, we're definitely moving to somewhere down the road, whether that's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, where there will simply be one South by Southwest badge, as opposed to an interactive badge, a music badge, or a film badge. That reflects that, yes, all these industries are melding together or converging, that these silos that were very obvious 20, 25, 30 years ago, that's a film person, that's a music person, that's a tech person, don't really exist anymore. So that's, on the one hand, that's a really neat development that we can kind of push everyone into one big group. On the other hand, it creates challenges because, again, just having those music, film, and interactive badges, while the definitions are less accurate now than ever before, it helped people kind of self-identify, see what their tribe was, and so that'll be a challenge moving forward. But, I think that broadly, one of the things that South by Southwest does really well is bring together all kinds of very, very creative people and mix them together, and there's some really neat connections that come out of that are a little bit atypical in terms of other conferences that are a little more focused on one particular thing.
You've always had a challenge of sort of managing the crowds, and especially as big as the conference is now, there are people who are like frustrated because they're turned away from a particular program they wanted to get to or whatever. I know that you've done a lot of work on that and that you've worked with consultants and so forth. How do you feel about the state of that problem now?
We have, I think, improved the experience of attendees a lot in the last couple of years in terms of just giving better expectations about where there will be lines and where there won't be lines. That said, there's still a lot of lines, and no one likes lines. I'm probably the absolute worst if I go to an event and there's a line, and I'm more impatient than anyone else. So that is a never-ending challenge of how to mitigate that, how to find bigger rooms that feel intimate, that can accommodate more people. I do think that the dynamic you tend to see at South by Southwest and other events is that the annoyance with lines is most on the first or second day of the event, and then people begin to get in the rhythm, begin to get a little more accepting that this is one of the challenges of the event, and that if there's a line, well, I'll go to something else, and it may end up being better. Again, that's not to say that this isn't a big problem that continues to need a lot of work, but saying that there's also a kind of a human element to this and psychology to this that we've noticed over the years as we've watched the patterns of attendance.
These lines that we're talking about, many of them are created by famous folk, and having an event attract those name stars, superstars, famous folks is a real benefit to the event, but it's also a bit of a challenge. How do you balance those two parts?
It's definitely a bit of a challenge. It's also something that's relatively new with South by Southwest, where we get big name people to return our calls or interested in speaking, and the big name people still represent at most 2 to 3% of the total programming. What South by Southwest is always about is discovering the next big thing, whether that's the next big filmmaker or the next big startup or the next big band or another cool idea that hasn't yet kind of popped in the mainstream. But you are correct that it is certainly easier to market and to create attention and to create buzz when you have bigger recognizable names. So yes, that is an ongoing challenge, and it is something that is always kind of hard to imagine, well, how are we going to beat that for the coming year? But we've been very lucky over the last few years, and I think every year has exceeded the previous one by a little in terms of the talent and creativity that we've been lucky enough to showcase.
How many people showed up last year?
In terms of badges, it's pretty much the same as we had in 2018, about 70,000 total badges. Now that's again if you had everyone with a badge, paid or comped badge, same place, same time. Thank goodness that never happens. But there were some, from 2004 to 2014, we had our own little hockey stick of growth, where we were just growing exponentially year to year. That growth has certainly become much more level as we've just kind of increased capacity, or as we kind of met the capacity of what we can do in Austin with hotels, with Airbnb, with other portions of our infrastructure.
And then typically, in addition to the badge holders, you have all these other people who just kind of show up on spring break. Last year, it didn't seem as dense because spring break happened at a different time. But
Yeah.
Are you back? Are you geared back?
We're
to spring
back
break
to,
now?
yeah, last year was, 2019 was the first year in 30 years that the South by Southwest spring break didn't coincide with the University of Texas or the Texas university system spring break. This year we're back to how it's been before. In addition to that, those 70,000 badge holders, yes, there's roughly 150,000, 200,000 consumers, quote unquote, that are in town attending free music shows, films, parties, that type stuff. So we know that Austin is very crowded during South by Southwest, and that is fun in a lot of ways, although certainly creates some challenges as well.
What's your favorite story about your South by Southwest experiences over the years?
My favorite stories are inevitably hearing from registrants or attendees after the event saying that they were able to find a job at South by Southwest or get a new job or find a co-founder or get funded. They met their boyfriend, their girlfriend, that type thing. So that's really neat to hear that you're helped create this event that has a real life impact on a lot of people. I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of really neat people backstage during South by Southwest, including 44, whose picture sits above us in my office, President Obama. That was really neat. So it's been fun and a total honor to be a part of so much creativity.
You've become kind of a celebrity yourself.
No, I haven't, John. That is absolutely not true.
I used to not think of you as a public speaker, but I see you having to do public speaking all the time now.
I have gotten slowly better, marginally better at public speaking, and that was because the bar was so low where I could barely walk on stage without, tripping over my feet because I was so nervous. And now I can. I've got the walking on stage without having throwing up before I do that. And that's testimony to the age-old maxim: the more you do something, the kind of slowly better you do it and get over your fear. And so I've improved, although I still have a long way to go before I'm reasonably competent at this.
Well, when you speak in Austin, the big elephant in the room is always that certain number of people who grumble whenever they hear the South by Southwest. Well, I can't get around, the traffic's horrible. Does that ever get old?
No, because their concerns and their complaints are entirely valid. It's hard to get around during South by Southwest. There's more traffic than usual, and it puts a lot of inconvenience on a lot of people. So, I think that they have as much right to voice those complaints as anyone else does. So I don't think that's, that kind of comes with the territory and is essentially a first world problem here. I do think that most people in Austin, even if complaining about it, take a sense of pride that the city has helped hatch this this incredible event. And by helped hatch, I mean that this South by Southwest couldn't have happened in any other place in the U.S. and any other place in the world. And it is part of the magic of Austin. It's helped put Austin on the map in a way that other things haven't, just simply because the bright spotlight that it shines on the city for 2 weeks out of the year, and that's neat. Personally and professionally neat. I always thought Austin was a really cool place to live, and I'm glad I'm lucky enough to be part of an event that's helped more people around the world understand that.
Well, thanks, Hugh.
Thank you.
I know you had a hard stop, and we can make that.
Excellent. Well, it's great to talk about some of the history of South by Southwest, and hopefully we can sit down another 10, 15, 20 years and have some more memories to share. Again, we'll reiterate something I said a few minutes ago, that the event has changed a ton since way back in 1987 when it started, or 1994 when we added in multimedia, and you've seen a ton of those changes, Jon, from your presence. I hope and I think the one thing that really hasn't changed is that massive emphasis on creativity and all the possibilities that creative thinking opens up. And it's one of the reasons that I'm so happy and so proud and so touched that we've had one of my favorite authors, Bruce Sterling, involved for so many years, because he's such a creative thinker. And the times I'm fortunate enough to see him speak at South by Southwest, I just kick myself and say, why can't I think like that?
It's always a highlight. He's got a lot of sparks flying.
Yeah, and it's he's kind of epitomizes so much of what I think is the DNA of South by Southwest, of just being able to think of things in a completely different way and get that thinking out there and spark people to new kinds of insights and new kinds of inspiration. That's neat.
Hugh Forrest and the South by Southwest staff have been hard at work on the next SXSW since the close of the 2019 event. South by Southwest 2020 runs from March 13th through March 22nd. With John Lipkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.